Hey guys, today we are going to be talking about human-environment interaction examples within Europe. So buckle up because here we go. Let's talk some mega crazy engineering things that are happening in Europe and how it progresses Europe's amazing site and situation advantages, as well as some of the cool things they're doing with the land. All right, here we go. Whoa, that's not what I wanted to do. Next. So what is human environment interaction? We talked about it as one of the 5 themes of geography way back at the beginning of the year. So who remembers? Anybody remember what it means? Let me get my pen out here. The definition is right there on your screen. So human environment interaction describes the ways in which humans influence and are in turn influenced by the surrounding ecosystems, the surrounding environment. So the definition I gave you guys at the beginning of the year is how do the people influence the environment and how does the environment influence the people? Back and forth in this kind of cyclical relationship. What that means in terms of Europe goes right in hand with what we were talking about with site and situation. So if you guys remember last time, we talked about the site and situation of Europe. So as a refresher, site is what the location looks like, specific characteristics that are present there. So like the soil composition, the type of vegetation, the culture of the people, how densely populated it is, what kind of buildings are there, what the weather's like, what the climate's like, all of that is site. Situation is how a site is connected to other sites around it. So are they really isolated up in the mountains all by themselves, or do they have, are they right down the river from another big settlement? Are there transportation networks in place that make access to it easy, or is it difficult to get there? Are there communications things set up so that they can communicate with outside settlements as well? So what does it look like? What's the relationship like between that site versus other sites? And we talked specifically about how a great site and situation has set Europe up for success. So we talked about the levels of development that Europe is experiencing, how quickly they developed, how quickly they industrialized, modernized, and a lot of that comes back to having a great site and situation initially. But there's more to it as well, right? That's just the initial setup. What Europe did with that great site and situation also contributes to their success. And that's where this human environment interaction piece comes in, okay? So the idea is that they took what was already there and utilized it for the benefit of human development of their people. Okay, so the 2 examples we're going to talk about today are polders and canals. You've probably heard of what a canal is. You probably don't know what a polder is, but we're going to talk about that right now. As we go through the 2, I want you to keep this question in mind. Which one did it better? So we're going to do kind of an evaluation of these 2 building strategies and engineering projects, and I want you to evaluate them based on the costs and benefits of each, based on pros and cons of each. Which do you think is a better solution for the various environmental situations they were faced with? Okay, here we go. Let's start with polders. So welcome to the Netherlands. These are all pictures that are very quintessential to what you will find in the Netherlands. They are the leading exporter of tulips in the world. So you see 3 pictures up there with tulips. There's a lot of very kind of quaint cultural pieces that are tied to the Netherlands. We refer to, or we hear about the wooden shoes with the cute little Dutch kids and the beautiful canals in Amsterdam and the windmills and the beautiful tulip farms. All of it makes for a very kind of beautiful and culturally rich backdrop for what you find in the Netherlands. When you go through the Nearpod that is attached to this lecture, the next slide is going to have you answer your initial impressions of the Netherlands based on the pictures that you just saw, okay? But for now, we're just going to move forward. So in 1953, there was a huge flood in the Netherlands. And so these are also pictures from the Netherlands. You can see the windmill in some of them. You can see very quintessential Dutch housing there as well. So what happened is high winds caused waves from the North Sea to crash into the low shores of the Netherlands. The dikes, which are kind of like dams or barriers, failed, and nearly 5% of the country was flooded, which when you're talking about an entire country, that's a huge chunk of land. 1,800 people were killed approximately, so a huge loss, huge disaster for the Netherlands. On the next slide, again, attached to the Nearpod, I'm going to ask you of the negative effects or the things that the Netherlands would have to deal with as a result of these floods. So think about the hit to the economy specifically. Obviously, the North Sea is saltwater, and so saltwater is really bad for farming. Salt is also very corrosive, so you can see all of the flooding would have pretty much decimated a bunch of buildings, right? There would be a lot of reconstruction. Also, the loss of life is fairly significant. And so all of those things would be things that you would have to find solutions to if you are the country of the Netherlands. Okay, so that is what this Nearpod question will be once you get into the Nearpod. So the answer that they came up with was something called Polders. The quote at the top of this slide I love. The idea that God created the world, but the Dutch created Holland. Now, Holland is another name for the Netherlands. So the idea that using engineering technology and advancements, the Dutch have found a way to sort of protect themselves from flooding and reclaim land as well. So a polder is land reclaimed from the sea by diking and draining are the two components. So windmills originally were used to power the pumps to drain the water from the reclaimed land. So as you look over here, the making of the polder is what this says. So step one, earthen dikes are built around a shallow area of water. Now notice the term shallow. Obviously you would never be doing this in the middle of the ocean where the water is hundreds of feet deep. It just isn't, right? That doesn't make sense. But around shallower areas of water, this is a distinct possibility of what you could do. Okay, so earthen dikes are built around a shallow area of water, and this is right here is the dike, this kind of barrier. Step two is here. So water then is gradually pumped away and drained off the land here as the water is diminished. Okay, step three, here, salt water leaves salt in the soil. Rain gradually washes the salt away. So sometimes they'll bring in additional minerals or additional soil to sort of till up the land and mix in with the saltiness to try to dilute it a little bit or deal with the salinity of it. But rain will ultimately wash it away eventually anyway. And you'll notice here, step four, alfalfa, which is a crop, is often the first crop that is sown. It has deep roots, which break up the soil, and alfalfa is also used for livestock feed, and so that's a really good kind of introductory grain for newly poldered land. And then step five here, in time the land can be used to grow many crops, such as the Dutch tulips. So basically what they've done is they have reclaimed land from the sea. They have to pick a shallow area of land where this makes sense. But in doing so, they build these huge barriers against the sea. Now, these are much stronger, much higher than what failed in the 1953 floods, much more technologically advanced. And so it's not as big of a concern as it used to be. So here, I love this map. Take a minute and just look at this map. So in 1300, so 700 years ago, this is what the coastline of the Netherlands look like. And today, notice, okay, so this area right here, this is the border that they share with Germany. Okay, so this is landlocked. It's the area that's out here that is the coast. So if you look between 1900 and 2000, when they started using polders, you see huge expanses of what used to be underwater and has now been reclaimed for the Dutch. It's become additional land in the Netherlands. You see the big area in here, and then obviously down through this area as well, with all the islands that have now kind of been filled in, as well as up here, right? Pretty much all along the coastline, they have done poldering very successfully. Okay. So here, I think I ask you for 3 pros and 3 cons to what you can think of for using land in this way, or reclaiming land in this way. Is this a good idea or is it a bad idea? And most of the responses, good in the sense that instead of with population growing in the Netherlands, you know, generally that means that the cities get more crowded. That means you have to build more skyscrapers and more apartment buildings to house everybody. But really in the Netherlands, their population density has not really gotten much worse than it used to be because the land has become bigger. And so as they add more people, they also add more land. And so they can spread out further. It also adds additional land for growing crops, not just tulips, but other crops and livestock as well, which obviously is a positive. And, you know, additional land for crops means additional resources, additional money, which obviously is a financial benefit. Most of the negatives in the use of polders are tied to environmental concerns. Okay, so the destruction of sea life, the destruction of ocean ecosystems, that kind of thing. So I want this question asked for a poll. Just tell me what you think. Do you think polders are a good idea? Yes, in that polders create more land rather than requiring the same amount of land to support an increasing number of people. Or no, polders are by definition below sea level, meaning they are prone to flooding. Also, polders negatively impact sea life and ecosystems. So tell me what you think. All right, let's start talking about canals next. This is Venice. So these are pictures from Venice, Italy. Venice is generally considered one of the most beautiful cities in the world. And you can see from the pictures that you may agree with that. The architecture is gorgeous. Obviously, the canals are very kind of, you know, obviously quintessential Venice. People from all over the world travel to Venice specifically to see the canals. But let's, the next slide is a Nearpod slide as well. And I'm going to ask you again for your impressions of Venice based on the pictures that you are seeing here. Okay. On this slide, this right here is sort of like the main thoroughfare through Venice. It's referred to as the Grand Canal. These pictures of Venice. But in this picture, you can see all the tourists over off to the side are walking on like a raised platform walkway. And the center of this piazza or this square, there's water. You can see the reflection of the buildings in the water because it floods. That's first showed you flooding in that slide. Now the specifics of Venice. So Venice was founded when people escaping invaders took shelter in what used to be a lagoon. So a lagoon is sort of a fancy a fancy name for a swamp, basically. So swamps are places that are kind of, you've got wetland mixed with dry land. Sometimes the water table comes up really high, and so even if you're on the actual dry land, you're going to be stepping through, you know, a couple inches of water, sort of like when you walk across your lawn right after the sprinklers have run for a couple of minutes, right? Where it's just sort of mushy and you get this as you walk across it. The lagoon originally had 120 islands. They have all kind of now been put together, basically, in what is now Venice. And then part of the mainland of Italy also is part of Venice, too. 150 canals snake through the city of Venice. There is one main one, which you saw. But originally, and still today, wooden pilings. So wooden pilings are basically like these big sort of tree trunk types of things that are sunk down into the swampy land in order to support the buildings that are built up on top. And so consider like really huge tree trunks that are stuck down into the bed of the swamp, of the lagoon, and then rafts of some sort of like floating foundation is built on top of them, and then the buildings go on top of those. But at this point, right, with modern construction, steel, glass, concrete, brick, right, all of those things are very heavy. And so today, still, modern society, the weight of the buildings is so great that Venice is actually sinking between 1 to 2 millimeters every year, which doesn't really seem like a lot. But if you're in the construction business, you know how important it is for things to stay level. And you know how dangerous it is if things start to sink or in any way become unstable. What happens then is that we'll mess with the foundations, which mess with the structure on top, right? You'll start to get cracks. You'll start to get a floor that isn't level. Tables, furniture that sit on top of it are also not level. And it messes with the stability and the safety of the building itself. And so if it gets too bad, then the building becomes unsafe and you actually have to tear the whole thing down or invest, thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars into the building in order to make it safe again, which is a huge investment. Especially if you consider that 1 to 2 centimeters, we'll take the average and say 1.5. That means that every 7.5 years, you've got an entire centimeter that it has sunk, which means every 15 years, it's 2 centimeters. And every 22 to 23 years, it's a little over an inch, right? So in my lifetime, Venice has sunk about 1.5 inches, which is a lot, again, when we talk about the stability and the safety of those buildings. When this is actually so again, on this slide, I believe this is the pros and cons slide where I'm going to ask you to come up with 3 pros and 3 cons for using canals in this building type of system in Venice. Okay. Slides back, huge issue. And then let's talk about the reality of Venice. So there are lots of problems with the canals. There's severe water pollution, industrial waste, which is like runoff from or industrial byproducts from manufacturing, right? So these are mostly chemicals. Sewage, yes, sewage is what you think it is, and salt water combined to eat away at buildings. So salt water, industrial waste, obviously, when we're talking about like chemicals and stuff, and salt water specifically are very, very corrosive. And so the wood that's underwater, any of the stone or steel that's underwater is just going to start to get rusted and eaten away by these corrosive materials that are finding their way into the water. Erosion also exists. Just the movement of water in and of itself means that things erode, right? That's why when you go to a riverbed, the rocks at the bottom are all smooth because the water has smoothed them out as it continues to, run across those rocks. The same thing happens on buildings, right? The more water moves through the buildings or moves against the buildings, the more it erodes away. Now, it isn't a fast process, but over time, sometimes tens, sometimes hundreds of years, you're going to start seeing really, really bad problems. And when you're talking about Venice, which is almost 1,000-year-old city, it becomes a huge component. and a huge consideration. Flooding also is an issue. I don't know if you guys noticed. And then when we add to one more thing, the other big thing is this concept of algae. So agricultural runoff is again some chemicals, but also like soil, seeds, plant byproducts, stuff like that. Those things all kind of work together with the ecosystem that is already there and creates conditions that promote algae. When algae is present in the water, it actually results in less oxygen in the water, which endangers fish and other ecosystems as well, and is a huge sort of like this invasive species for the lagoon and the health of the lagoon. And so we don't want that either. All right. So the Netherlands also have canals. This picture up here is Amsterdam. That is the main, it's the capital of the Netherlands. Constructed in the 1600s, Amsterdam has a ring of canals called the Grachtengordel is how you say that. So these canals are, similar to the age of the Venetian canals, hundreds and hundreds of years old. And they're running into the same issues that Venice is, right? With pollution, with erosion, with, these crumbling walls and crumbling bridges. And all of those things are fixable, but it requires an awful lot of money to do that, especially when we're talking about having to build on top of water. And it also becomes frustrating knowing that you're going to be building stuff that it will be in contact with water all the time, because you'll know that it will just continue to get to have issues, right? The erosion never stops when you're talking about being underwater. The corrosion and the kind of the flooding, all of those pieces are kind of just, you have to live with them. So you're just kind of sinking more and more money into something that will continue requiring more and more money. So for the canals in the Netherlands, they were dug out and water was pumped out in a similar land reclamation process as the Polders. Wooden and concrete pilings were used and built on, but now bridges and canal walls are crumbling from weight and from wear. So again, we're talking about the weight of a modern society, right? Our roads are concrete or asphalt. Our buildings are made with steel and glass and brick and more concrete, right? It isn't the wooden buildings that it used to be. Things are heavy. Cars are heavy as they're driving around. You actually can't drive cars in Venice. Cars are not allowed. I think they have bikes and scooters and boats, obviously, but no actual cars. But they do have cars in Venice, which again is another huge weight consideration. And then obviously just the people. All of that creates more additional wear and tear on the infrastructure that exists. So I think this is where I ask you to tell me about what you think. Better polders, better canals, and tell me why. And then the last question, you are going to explain to me how the concept of polders and canals illustrates the theme or the component of human environment interaction within geography. It is really cool to see what various countries, various groups of people in Europe have done to take what resources and advantages they had originally and make them continue to work for a growing, modernizing population, which is that whole concept of taking site and situation, adding in human environment interaction, and seeing what we come up with. And in Europe, really cool advantages, really great cities that are very specific, with specific cultural elements that bring tourists in, which obviously brings money in. And so Europe has done a really great job of utilizing site and situation, as well as introducing these new techniques to make that site and situation the most beneficial for them that they can. Now, whether or not you agree with what they've done, or the impacts that those decisions have made on those various cities and various environments, that's where I want you to tell me what you think, okay? With that, next time we are actually going to play Settlers of Catan. So you will consider the site and situation idea as well as the building concept and utilizing site and situation as we play our game, okay? Now you will need to go through the Nearpod. Obviously, you're welcome to refer to the slides again, but they don't have the explanation that this video has provided. And I wanted to make sure that you got that as well so you can get full points on the Nearpod. But just go through the Nearpod and answer the questions. And then I'll see you guys on Thursday. Okay, nice job.